Sitting next to Stephanie, we have Judy Hellman, who is a professor emeritus of the Department of Political Science and the Department of Social Science, as well as being appointed to the graduate program in Social and Political Thought. Judy is also a gifted communicator. She writes books that are academic books, but also books that just anybody can read. And I can attest to that because I had a niece once who was going to have an exchange student from Mexico, asked me for some information about Mexico because she wanted to be informed, and I gave her Judy's book, Mexican Lies. And it really had a profound impact on her. It really helped her to understand this person who'd come from another country, and that, I think, is a really great talent. Judy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. I confess I was a little bit surprised to be put on a panel about education for democracy, but then it was very stimulating to think about it. But before I begin to talk on that theme, I'd simply like to say, I'm limited in my time, so I will simply say that Steve and I sat there trying to remember when we did meet Leo and Melanie, and for me it's very clear in mind because Vida was just born, and Vida's age is a knowable number, and so I can count. But for Steve it was kind of lost in time because it had been several years before this lovely encounter and dinner together in London at their flat. But Steve had met Leo at a dissertation defense of all places. So that was a little fuzzier. Nonetheless, what I want to necessarily limit myself to saying at this point is that food and good times have always been central to our friendship. But more important, what I want to say is that the caring and warmth and generosity of Melanie and Leo to their friends, to their old friends, to friends who are old, and I think people like Avi and Sam and others in the room will bear this out, has always been given in sickness and in health. Most recently, it's absolutely true. In most recent times with Leo, who fortunately we just live a block away, we live on the same street, or as was once said by Leo, in the same shtetl. Most recently with Leo coming by, rushing up Palmerston Avenue with a double portion of chicken soup for Steve, which was made by Melanie. So, I mean, she wasn't there at the moment, but the love was there. So I just want to acknowledge that, although much, much more can be said, and I think will be said in the course of this event. So let me turn now to this question of education for democracy, and confess to you that every morning I jump out of bed and I flip on the Jazz FM station in hopes of hearing the BBC News, because I feel that, I mean, how can I begin my day if I can't stay informed about the it's always 8 most worrying events that were unfolding while I was peacefully sleeping. And the BBC News, which we can hear at 7, 8, or 9, those are the only times on that jazz station, will bring me that news. And it sometimes happens that I'm a little late. It's like 8:02 instead of 8 o'clock on the button when I manage to turn the dial. And I can't quite make out, you know, I'm hearing about someone who is imprisoning the opposition in his country. And I hope I don't have to say his or hers, I should. But in any case, or expelling the opposition. I don't know, is it Nicolas Maduro, is it Rodrigo Duterte, is it Erdogan, is it Mugabe? I mean, who is the subject of the sentence? I have to listen up to make sure. And then I know if it's not so much imprisoning those who oppose their rule as promising to lock them up on the day after the election, it could be Donald Trump. So I want to just underscore that we live in very troubled times with respect to democracy. And we need all the more reason, we have all the more reason to focus and concentrate on how we deal with that as teachers. Even last week, a person could be forgiven for being confused upon hearing that people who had gone to the polls to vote had rubber bullets raining down on them, and thinking, oh, that must be Erdogan. But no, they weren't elections, so I guess it's all unfolding in Barcelona. So We don't know where it will pop up next, but we know, yes, we have to dedicate ourselves to this role that suggests itself to us as teachers. And I also want to underscore something that comes out of our departmental past, because in this historical moment, we would do well to remember it, and that is, it didn't seem strange back then, but when Leo was our chair, we were all encouraged to think very hard about how we could turn our department, and specifically our classroom, into a space for developing and reinforcing democratic practices, like a kind of a boxing gym for democracy right there in the classroom. And under Leo's leadership, we collaborated in a democratic manner to come up with a statement that would sum up our commitment to using the university, and very specifically the Department of Political Science, to advance and reinforce democracy. And I recall that in a departmental council meeting, there was even some suggestion, there was a kind of a claque, if I may refer to these people in this manner, of people who thought that we should take this stirring statement that was already available in some way. I don't think we posted it on the democracy wall at that point, but that this should be reproduced and stapled to each and every course outline. So, I mean, think about that for a moment. It meant that you would have course outlines with the democracy page at the front, and the do not steal, cheat, or plagiarize page at the back. And I have to confess that upon hearing this in council, I began to feel a little panicky. I did. Because as Stephanie correctly said, Leo is a profound egalitarian. But I began to imagine that students would read this preamble to the course outline and come away with the idea that we were really going to run a course based on full participatory democracy, full participatory principles, and that they themselves would be choosing the readings, the standards of evaluation, the order of lectures. Indeed, maybe there would be no lectures, maybe there would be no formal lecture discussion, nothing. And I began to worry. But when I expressed this, I was pretty open about it when my turn came on the speakers list. But happily, there were wiser colleagues present, more experienced than me, and they said, don't worry. The students are so unlikely to read this screed. And I might say, the people referring to it as a screed, of course, weren't the claque who had written it. So don't worry about it being held to this standard. They're not going to know. They'll skip over to it, and they'll look at when the exam is, how much credit it takes, and so forth. And in fact, it's faded from, I don't remember seeing it at the front of my course outline in recent times. Okay. But in truth, when I look back on the time when Leo was our chair, I remember it as a wonderful, wonderful moment for democratic debate and discussion. I do. And I should also say that I can remember many occasions, not only at his kitchen table, but on the times when he generously offered me rides home, that we debated all the way down to Palmerston Avenue. And there were sometimes moments when I thought maybe when we're caught in traffic at Eglinton as we wait to merge off the Allen Expressway, it wouldn't be inappropriate for me to say, well, thanks so much, jump out of the car and take the subway back. Because Leo always won the arguments, and we had, in fact, discussions about pedagogy, discussions about the proper way to run a graduate seminar. And Leo, I won't detail things, I don't have enough time, but I will say he wasn't having much of what I was serving up as my argument. But I later came to see evidence of it in his course outline. A student showed me the course outline and said, oh, I had my influence. So that's how it is with Leo. You have these discussions with him, and you don't always come away thinking you persuaded him, but you have. And let me say in this regard, because Colin is here, something I stumbled on a week ago was a recording of the wonderful celebration we had for the Socialist Register anniversary. And this I see it was in 2014 recording, but I thought it was 2013 that we had the big hoo-ha at Ryerson. But let me say that I spoke then, and I will just mention in passing now that one of the best experiences of my intellectual life was to have had an article commissioned by Leo and Colin, to have handed them an outline, which they seemed to think was good enough and very appropriate, to have turned in an article that was full of things they didn't agree with and would have been happier to see me change, to have a lot of back and forth in the most fruitful manner, and to come out having the article published, albeit with a response in the following issue of a very rare occurrence in the history of Socialist Register. At that point, it was only the second time it had occurred. They found a respondent to punch me out, but they gave me the chance, a la New York Review of Books, to also respond to my respondent. It was a wonderful experience for me. Never had work taken more seriously, and it was very fulfilling, and I thank them both for that. But it really is evidence of the commitment to democratic exchange. Okay, that much said. I want to, if I get the time, I want to turn now to the current moment where democratic practice is challenged or under attack on every side, and that this democratic deficit is as evident in the classroom as in the political arena. And I hope I will surprise some of you with what I'm going to say. I have two examples of challenges of education for democracy. And the first basically goes back to the famous police raid on an underground essay writing outfit in downtown Toronto that came up with custom-made essays and supplied these to the better off students who had the means to purchase made-to-order final term papers. And they turned out to be, as it would emerge when the evidence was in, more University of Toronto students than New York students, because these were pretty pricey items. But this, by the way, well before internet, obviously, and even before, I think it had to have been before email, because the evidence trace was all on paper. The police seized whole file cabinets full of the order sheets. And on these order sheets, as you may or may not know in terms of whether students have ever been open with you about this, were the requisites that the would-be buyer was asking for in the paper, and that included whether the specific sources that were supposed to be used, the length of the paper, how many sources needed to be cited, what was the grade the student hoped to attain, and the smart money knew better than to ask for an A. If these were people who could never have earned an A, they asked for a B, B+ kind of paper. But there was also a box, there were boxes to check to indicate the slant. And among the York students, overwhelmingly, what do you think? The slant box that they checked was feminist and Marxist. Okay. Well, I have to say I was very upset by this. I was very upset by the idea that they had us. And I have many, many times talked to the TAs in the very first session that we used to always have at our home. We would always have TAs over, and so that we could go well beyond the requisite 2 hours by eating and drinking. But in those sessions, one of the things I would always bring to light was this, what I regard as a very sad story. With the hope that I could persuade them that in a democratic classroom, of course we put our ideas out there, but we certainly don't want anyone to leave that classroom thinking that if they don't tell us what we want to hear, that we will be disappointed and that it will be a telling thing when it comes to our grading, and that we won't treat them with the fairness and respect that we would hope everyone would have. Okay. How much more time have I got? 2 minutes?
Yep, 2 minutes. Okay. I'll give you a Stephanie minute.
Oh, good, thank you. All right, so I'll close simply with a second thing, a second illustration of what I think is a huge challenge in the democratic, well, let's say, in education for democracy. And that is that I have always found it to be a very tough sell to persuade students that the ideas that they find to be wrong, not to mention abhorrent, are supposed to enjoy protection under the law, and open hearing in the classroom. In short, the basic argument that if we want to have for free speech for ourselves, we have to guarantee it to others. And the point isn't, well, I'm a socialist, and will I guarantee it to a social democrat? No, that's not the stretch that we have in mind when we say that this is the challenge. Okay, it's a biggie, and it's very hard, effectively, to push through with the students. But coming up on of all things, on the TTC, I ran into a grad student who had been in my course 3 years ago. And he was very troubled. It hadn't happened to him, but he thought it could happen at any time. But one of his colleagues had someone walk into the classroom wearing a Make America Great Again hat. And you got to figure that someone's not wearing that hat because they want no one to notice it, or it wasn't around backwards, but it was there. And how should that happen? What do you do about that? We had a great discussion about what you do about that, how you diffuse that situation, and how you give that person, some kind of platform so that we can open a discussion. Why should those people be shunned? Anyone who is bold enough to do that at York really does want to be heard, and can be heard, and should be heard. Okay. I have no more time.
You have no more, but you want to wrap up?
I would wrap up just by telling you about something that happened in this very Senate chamber 2 years ago now. We were about to have at Latin American Studies Association the big 50th anniversary. It's the 50th anniversary of everything, as we all know, people who've lived long enough, and it was the anniversary of Latin American Studies Association, and they were going to the biggies of the biggest to speak in the plenary sessions, and one of them was Fernando Enrique Cardoso, who had started out as a lefty intellectual, much like people in this room, but who had become president of Brazil, in the course of which he had instituted neoliberal policies. And that's not all. There were a lot of things people had against him, but the long and short of it was that he had been invited the year before to be the keynote speaker, and the people in my section of LASA, for which we each paid $10 to have this identity. It's the rural section, which is what I used to do about 40 years ago, but I still stay with this group because they're good folks. Well, they started the movement to disinvite him. And in fact, the more radicals weren't satisfied with disinviting the person who'd been invited to be the keynote speaker, Cardoso, but they wanted the resignation of the people. Whoever it was who had thought to invite him should resign. Bang, like that. Okay. And so there's a lot of toing and froing, and I must say that the majority position was get his ass, get him out of here, and the minority position, articulated by people like me and a couple of others, was, well, why would you be afraid of what he would say? We'll all be there. It's going to be a room chock-a-block with people who can respond. This didn't carry. Okay. So what I was able to do was the following. I was able to take the example of our colleague, Ricardo Greenspoon, known certainly to everyone from New York, who in this Senate chamber, as George presided, brought in a whole bunch of us who normally don't attend Senate and who were made senators for the day so that we could be here, Richard Wellen and a lot of other people, but very heavily populated by Jewish faculty, to make the argument that the conservative Jewish organizations that were turning the screws on our administration to prohibit the presence on campus of any speaker arguing for Palestinian rights, that Palestinian rights need to be discussed in any discussion about Israel and Palestine, that we needed to oppose that in a university everyone should get to speak, hey. And that it carried the day, and it allowed me to make the argument that if we want it for ourselves, we have to guarantee it to everyone. And so I was able to write back to the list, and I'm sure that at least 3 people's minds were changed. Okay. Thank you.